Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video for Political Science 2301, History of Political Thought 1. Once again, I'm your teaching assistant Kevin O'Mara, and for this episode, I'm going to be doing a close reading of the Republic, Book 1. So last video I spoke about ancient Greece, some administrative issues like Stephanus pagination, and also some of Plato's methods, including the dialogical form, the Socratic method, and Socratic irony. While we begin to dig into the Republic to get a feel for these tools, today we're going to dive right in with a close reading of the entire first book. So before we start speaking about Book 1 of the Republic, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the structure of the work as a whole. So in Book 1, Plato sets the scene and introduces the characters, as well as some themes that show up throughout the work. In Books 2 to 4, Plato searches for the look of justice and talks about education, and also, particularly in Book 4, speaks about justice in the city and in the soul through Socrates and his interlocutors. In Books 5 through 7, Socrates speaks of the nature of eros in the body and the soul, and also speaks about the famous theory of philosophy and philosopher kings and their role in the Republic. In Books 8 and 9, Socrates speaks about justice in practice, speaks about the ideal regime and its degenerations, and also speaks about justice in the soul, and compares tyranny and philosophy. In the final book, that's Book 10 of the Republic, Plato, through Socrates, speaks about divine justice, the limits of poetry, and the myth of the cosmos. Just to give a brief recap on Plato's method in the Republic, Plato uses the dialogue form, wherein each person represents a different perspective or point of view that adds parts to the whole of the work, and rather than a simple explanation of what he believes, Plato lets us dive into the action of the text by forcing us to pick apart arguments, sometimes develop passionate affinities to certain characters, and also forces us to detect sarcasm and read through the lines. As mentioned in the last video, philosophy is derived from two root words from Greek, philo and sophia, philo meaning love, and sophia meaning wisdom, which means that philosophy is the love of wisdom, with wisdom being a topic that comes up again and again throughout the Republic. The names of the characters are highly important to the text, and were deliberately chosen to indicate different points of view. Many ancient Greek authors liked to critique one another by name in their works, and Plato was no exception. Most of the characters present in the Republic were indeed real historical figures, including Socrates, whose name means one with strength, Polemarchus, which means easygoing, Cephalus, his father, the head of the family, Glaucon, the gleaming or shining one, and Adeimantus, the war ruler, those two latter characters actually being Plato's brothers in real life, as well as Thrasymachus, the bold fighter, who we'll be speaking of extensively in today's lecture. Now I'm going to be setting the scene a little bit. I spoke of the first couple of pages in my last video, but now we're going to really unpack the historical context and some of the content of the text in the first couple of lines in the Republic. So the background to the dialogue historically is the so-called twofold crisis, the looming threat to Athenian democracy due to the war with Sparta, as well as the trial and death of Socrates. So one interesting element of the Republic is that Plato does not give an indication of which year the dialogue takes place in. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta lasted from 431 to 404 before Common Era, leading to the year-long reign of the 30 tyrants. During this period, the Spartans abolished Athenian democracy and killed approximately 5% of the Athenian population. The Republic certainly took place either during the war, during the reign of the 30 tyrants, or immediately after it, which sets a tone for many of the politically salient discussions on what is just. The second aspect of the so-called twofold crisis is Socrates' looming execution at the hands of the Athenian democratic government. After democracy was restored in Athens, Socrates was condemned to death by a jury of his peers a mere 5 years later for corrupting the youth with his teachings. The dangers of both tyranny and democracy are constantly foreshadowed throughout the work, and the intimate relationship between the individual and the complex systems within which they live are shown time and time again. In setting the scene, it is also important to note the word choices used by Plato. Socrates went down to the Piraeus yesterday to watch a festival and a feast with Glaucon. Second, Socrates was stopped by Polemarchus' slave, taken to the house of Cephalus to converse on the nature of justice. The use of these passive and active words, as well as symbols and metaphors, are all deliberate and immediately introduce many of the Republic's themes, albeit in a slightly covert way. Cephalus is the first character with whom Socrates engages in a meaningful dialogue. Cephalus represents custom and tradition, and he has a fairly traditional view on the nature of justice, meaning telling the truth, paying debts, keeping promises, and obeying the law. Cephalus is the father, the head of the household, the elder merchant, and has a view that's taken from his experience in business and with the market. He's not an Athenian citizen, so he has economic but not political experience. His definition and understanding of justice is practical, but not theoretical. It's not very reflective. On his way to make a sacrifice, later on, after he speaks to Socrates, it shows that he's old and thinking about the gods. He's squaring his accounts and hedging his bets. His concern with the nature of justice is late and self-interested. He's mostly just worried about going to Hades for not being just while he was alive. Socrates asks him about what it's like to be an elder. He asks him about his relationships with women, and Cephalus argues that justice is actually significantly easier now that the desire of his youth has faded, indicating that old age isn't necessarily a bad thing. He hints that earlier on in his life he may not have always been so just, and he may have gotten some wealth and ill-gotten gains. But then he asks why Socrates hasn't been a more frequent visitor to speak to him about these issues. Socrates doesn't challenge Cephalus' views on justice directly, due to his respect for elders and custom, but there is a hint of irony in the way that Socrates engages with Cephalus. Cephalus' idea of justice is customary and relies on contract, based on giving people what they deserve, but mostly it's based on individual interest, utility, and reciprocity. The individual interest that Cephalus has for being just comes from the fact that he doesn't want to suffer in Hades after his life. Socrates' conversation with Cephalus could have gone in a number of different directions, but it immediately turns to a discussion on the nature of justice. Socrates is prone to getting immediately to the root of the problem and recognizes that Cephalus' recommendations to tell the truth, pay debts, and obey pagan law are claims about the nature of justice. When Cephalus leaves, laughing, it is clear that he is a pious man who has no patience for philosophical speculation. His account of justice is practical, traditional, and simple, and requires no abstract justification beyond the immediate fear of going to Hades. As Cephalus leaves, his son Polemarchus attempts to salvage his argument. Polemarchus' first argument for the nature of justice is that justice is to give each what he is owed. He quotes Simonides, an old poet, saying at 331e that, quote, "It is just to give to each what is owed to him," end quote. Citing an expert, Polemarchus has the unreflective common sense of the middle-class gentleman. He begins with his father's understanding. Justice is keeping contracts, obeying the law, doing what's expected, and he says that utility and reciprocity at the level of individual justice and self-interest is sufficient in describing the nature of justice. Socrates challenges this view of justice. He subsets it to a rational critique and argues that we should move beyond the practical ideas of justice to discover the theoretical principle that makes justice what it is. And he provides the example of the madman and the weapon. Socrates argues that if you were to borrow a weapon, say an axe, from a friend, who then later develops a bloodthirstiness and wants to kill both you and himself, that it would not necessarily be just to give to him what is owed, even though under contract law, it does rightfully belong to him. This means that Socrates questions justice not only the level of the individual, but the social level. Not everything can be applied universally, and there are different aspects of justice. It has a variability that must be thought through to a higher principle, because it's not necessarily applicable at every single level if you're speaking about justice from the level of just giving to everyone what they are owed in a practical sense. So it is here that there is a transition from speaking about justice on a personal level to a collective level. Polemarchus accepts this argument and speaks about how justice is helping friends and harming enemies, a more abstract principle, where he moves from the individual to political justice, the interests of the group. In this sense, justice is related to the common good of the social group, insiders versus outsiders. And he also argues that justice is doing useful things. Justice is a skill, art, or techne. A techne is a disciplined body of knowledge founded on a grasp of the truth about what is good and what is bad in matters of concern to it. For example, in the art or techne of shoemaking, what is good for shoemaking is the ability to make good shoes. In the text, they also speak about skills of advanced medicine or sea piloting. The art or techne of a doctor is to be able to apply the right medicine to heal a body. The techne of a sea pilot is to be able to command a ship and sail it. And both of these have to do with different areas of the human expertise. The words skill and virtue in relation to different technes is derived from the word arete, which could also be translated to excellence or goodness. Arete has a broader meaning than virtue, as it applies to all objects. The arete of a knife, for instance, could be said to be having the property of a sharp blade. That is the main skill or aspect of it that makes it what it actually is. The arete of a human being is less clear, as it could be intelligence, bravery, or perhaps even the quality of being just. So if a doctor is able to apply medicine to the proper bodies, and a shoemaker is able to make shoes for the proper feet, what does the just person do? What are they able to do? What is their particular skill, or arete, of justice? Through dialogue, they recognize that it's too broad to fit into one thing, or one art form, or one techne. This is much like the qualities of guarding, which requires trust, or money-making in general application. Through argument, they recognize that the best guard, the person who is just, can also be the best thief, because the qualities that make them a good guard also make them a great thief. So skill alone cannot define what it means to be just. Techne of all kinds, any kinds of skill, are morally neutral. Whether or not somebody makes good shoes or is a good doctor does not determine their level of justice. Therefore, the interlocutors demand a higher guiding principle in application to determine what justice actually is. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the Socratic interrogation reveals more questions than answers. What is the good? And ultimately, who are one's friends and enemies? So ultimately, in this section of the dialogue between Polemarchus and Socrates, Polemarchus realized he shifted the argument from that which his father made, when he states that justice is when one is good to their friends, but bad to their enemies. Rather than simply following the law, which dictates that one ought to return a borrowed weapon to their bloodthirsty friend, Polemarchus recognizes that just people must make their own judgments in spite of the law. In this sense, his argument is more abstract than his traditional father's, and may also reflect a transition from an oligarchical to a democratic conception of justice, which we will revisit in our classes on Aristotle. This argument that justice is when one does good for one's friends and bad to their enemies is a popular opinion that manifests itself as patriotism at the level of the collective. As such, Polemarchus likens justice to the art of war, wherein one must discern who is an ally and who is a friend, and deliver unto each what one believes is just. Socrates, however, points out that harming people does not make them more just as harming a horse only makes them worse for wear. Punishment and brutality only serves to increase the amount of injustice in the world, and as such, rehabilitation, or at least doing no harm, is seen as a much more just approach to one's enemies, or people who are unjust in general. It is at this point that the crusader for injustice, Thrasymachus, makes his bold entrance. Thrasymachus is a sophist. He believes that justice, at first, is merely the rule of the stronger. He bursts in like a beast, so it says in the dialogue. He uses force rather than pure discussion, and he believes that mere philosophical discourse is too gentle. He wants action, because knowledge is power. He accuses Socrates of withholding and assembling information. He accuses Socrates of knowing more than he's letting on. Socrates narrates that he was trembling and afraid at Thrasymachus' entrance, but this too may be an example of Socratic irony. After Socrates says to Thrasymachus at 336e that it is, quote, far more appropriate for us to be pitied by you clever people, quote, Thrasymachus explicitly calls him out, saying at 337a that, quote, that's just Socrates' usual irony. I knew that you'd be unwilling to answer, and that if someone questioned you, you'd be ironical and do anything but give us an answer. End quote. Thrasymachus is a sophist who teaches rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and he claims to know how to get and maintain political power to seduce the ambitious youth of Athens. He says at 337d that Socrates must pay a fine to hear him speak, just like any fine sophist, to which the other people in the room quickly oblige, given that Socrates has no money. Thrasymachus accuses Socrates of hiding, failing to speak straight about natural justice being might makes right, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Socrates responds that if Thrasymachus claims to know what justice is, he must possess a kind of knowledge or wisdom, but that knowledge only serves the good. Expertise serves a useful purpose and is determined and limited by that purpose. Thrasymachus argues at 338 BC that justice is merely the advantage of the stronger. Each active political system, be it tyranny or democracy, is set up such to give those who rule happiness at the expense of everyone they rule over. Speaking from the position of realpolitik, Thrasymachus says that there is no higher principle of justice, but that the rulers in power make laws for their own advantage, punish anyone who acts against them as being unjust, and that this is the true function of justice. Socrates responds by arguing that rulers like tyrants make mistakes and may harm themselves to the benefit of those they rule, at which point Thrasymachus retorts that when rulers in a strict sense rule, they are infallible. Similarly, the moment a shoemaker makes a mistake when making a shoe, they are not a shoemaker. So when a ruler makes a mistake and accidentally harms themselves, that at that very moment they are no longer a ruler. Socrates then refutes Thrasymachus' sophism, arguing that there are limits of politics as a techne, or art. He argues that if politics is knowledge, it must serve and be defined by that purpose, that is, the proper functioning of the thing that it makes. For instance, a shoemaker is limited in his action by the proper functioning of a shoe. If ruling is an art, or a techne, as Thrasymachus admits, then it is a techne that is concerned with creating something. The shoemaker, as such, is a person who makes shoes. The doctor, as such, is a person whose function it is to apply medicine to cure bodies. And the ruler, as such, is one who is concerned with their proper object or function, namely, to rule for the well-being of the people they rule over. Socrates argues that a politician is likewise a public servant, who serves and is limited by the proper functioning of the city. The moment that a politician does not fulfill their proper function of ruling over a city justly, then they are no longer a politician, thus pointing out the contradiction in Thrasymachus' claim. The ruler for Socrates is one whose function is to rule, and as in other technes, this function must be performed with the quality of the techne's final creation in mind. Socrates says on 347d, quote, anyone who is really a true ruler does not seek his own advantage, but that of his subject, end quote. This raises the philosophical question about the nature of techne and politics. Can techne, or the art, be applied to people as it is to natural objects? And if so, if the function of scissors is to cut, the function of the shoemaker is to make shoes, what is the function of a person, a human being, as such? So there is a difference between making and applying force for a human purpose to natural objects versus human beings themselves. It's not so easy to say what exactly humans are on Earth for. Next, Thrasymachus revises his argument, arguing that justice is a convention, the rules of the regime. He argues that justice is the rule of the stronger, where the stronger is defined as a ruling regime. Justice is the law as laid down by the regime in its own interest. This is a conception of positive law, without any higher principle to which to reach to understand what justice is. To attain this, to argue for this further, Thrasymachus speaks about the story of the shepherd. The shepherd may seem like they're taking care of the sheep for their own. To make this argument, Thrasymachus turns to the story of the shepherd. The shepherd may seem like they're taking care of the sheep for the well-being of the sheep, but is actually just raising them to turn them into lamb chops for the shepherd's own gain. The shepherd only pretends to serve the interests of the sheep so that he may seek their advantage later on. Thus it is shown that man may know what justice is, but seek injustice to his own advantage. He may set up and manipulate political rules for his own gain. Even if man knows what justice actually is, even if someone knows what justice actually is, they may act unjustly for their own advantage. The rulers and the strong reap the benefits of justice, while others obey the law. The rulers and the strong reap the benefits of justice while seeking to gain their own advantage, while foolish just people obey the law. Thrasymachus advances the arguments of tyranny. Rulers rule in their own interest and for their own advantage. He claims to know the art of ruling, the techne of ruling, to use force, fraud, pandering, and anything else he can to persuade and manipulate the demos, to secure power for the ambitious youth of Athens in his job as a sophist. Socrates counters Thrasymachus' argument once again, arguing that justice is not a mere convention, but there exists an objective standard to which justice appeals to. Socrates is not persuaded by Thrasymachus' tyranny and calls him a demonic man. He says that the problem with tyranny is that tyrants think they are the only ones with reason, that only they can calculate advantage. But everyone in the room knows the look of tyranny, and everyone agrees it is the worst possible regime. Nobody in the room believes that tyrants are the happiest people or that tyranny is the absolute best possible political system, and Thrasymachus doesn't win the argument. In this instance, much to his chagrin, he is not an orator, strictly speaking. Once he becomes embarrassed, he demands to have another long speech to make his points, but Socrates says that he will continue to ask him questions so that the spectators may probably understand. Thrasymachus is thus tamed by Socrates, whose use of dialogue ends up defeating the force of the beast. Socrates argues that tyranny creates factions between people, that tyranny lives by the sword and dies by it. The tyrant, far from being happy, is actually the most miserable at all, because he can't trust anyone, and constantly has to fluctuate between acting justly and unjustly. For Socrates, justice instead is natural. It is necessary because human beings are by nature social and political. People must live with each other, so they must be able to look to the common good. Socrates uses the example of bands of robbers, arguing that any collective enterprise requires cooperation. Cooperation requires that justice not only is known, but is actually practiced among them. Socrates says at 351e, and this is good for the essay question, quote, "Injustice has the power to make whatever it arises in, whether it is a city, a family, an army, or anything else, incapable of achieving anything as a unit because of the civil wars and difference it causes. This explains how injustice causes disharmony among the parts of a unity, among the parts of a city, or even among the unity of an individual. A city full of robbers and unjust people could never last long unless there is some degree of justice that is allowing them to maintain contracts with one another and live for a common good. In this sense, even Socrates admits here that the common good is derived from the private calculation of self-interested individuals who mutually agree to be just, insofar as it maintains some degree of harmony and order through a mutual contract. This leads to the end of Book 1, where Thrasymachus is tamed. He can't win the argument, but he isn't convinced either. He decides to stay in the group and senses that Socrates maybe possesses a wisdom that he does not, and he wants to know more. He, like all the others in the room, have a desire for this knowledge that can be brought upon by Socrates. We're left with the experience of wanting to know more. Book 1 is a bit of a clearing of potential definitions of justice, a rational analysis of different perspectives or definitions on justice, but unfortunately all of these potential definitions have been found wanting. We're just beginning the search. We are at Book 1 of 10, after all. So after Book 1, we know that justice is something between nature and convention, that it is a human affair, and that it is more than mere techne. It is a skill or knowledge, but it is not morally neutral. It is tied to experience and virtue. We know that it has a natural look that is accessible to reason, and that the task of the dialogue is to bring it into view. So here, at the end of the first book, we are left with Socrates' refutation of Cephalus, the traditionalist, Polemarchus, the democrat, and Thrasymachus, the tyrant, but provided with no conception of justice beyond Socrates' own. While he figures that it is necessary to maintain harmony, he explicitly states at 354c that as a result of the discussion, quote, "I know nothing," end quote. All Socrates is left with is a deeper articulation of the problem of justice, the techne that assigns to everyone what is good for the soul and determines the common good of the city. So in conclusion, and to review at the end of the book, this leaves us with a number of different questions that it would be good to ponder on. Firstly, what is the significance of setting the scene? Why was it so important for the Republic to take place during or immediately after the rule of Spartan tyranny over Athenian democracy? How is the use of Plato's active and passive language, as well as symbols and metaphors, foreshadowing the rest of the Republic? What are the different positions of the characters, and how are they related to the question of justice? Why does Plato present this dialogue on justice as a dialogue with many different perspectives, rather than a single treatise where he just tells us what justice is? In what way can justice be linked with utility? Does justice merely make things useful or people useful, or is there something beyond that? What is the difference between individual and political justice? Is there a tension between what is good or just for the individual and what is good or just for the political collective, regardless of what political system we're in? Is justice the rule of the stronger, might makes right? Or is there some other deeper principle that allows justice to exist beyond this positive legal conception? What is the relationship between justice with nature and convention? What is the relation of techne, or the various human arts, to justice? What is the relation of justice to virtue, experience, and knowledge? Thank you so much for joining me on this reading of Plato's first book of the Republic. I know that there's a lot of content going on here, so I would definitely suggest maybe going over Book 1 again and parsing through the arguments, getting a read on the subtle undercurrents that are happening throughout the book and throughout the arguments. Again, the arguments that Socrates is making aren't necessarily airtight arguments, and I don't believe that they should be just taken at face value as the beliefs that Plato has. So once again, thank you. Thank you for watching. Join me in my office hours on Monday from noon to 2 p.m. And once again, the unexamined life. And again, remember that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates.